As, as we sit here on different countries across Australia and in some cases across the world, I'd like to acknowledge the country that I'm sitting on, which is the Dharawal country of the Yuin people. And in particular this week, I'd like to acknowledge the life of Australia's greatest actor, David Dalaithunga, who his family have now given permission to be known as Gulpilil. And this was the man who introduced me to Aboriginal ways and Aboriginal knowledges. And I remember the first time I saw the film Walkabout, right through to the film Charlie's Country. And it makes me realize that we, as visitors to this country, we are the guests of the Indigenous people who have been here for many tens of thousands of years. And as such, I would like to acknowledge the custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples to this place and the places others are sitting on. And this space has kept alive the relationships between all living things. The university acknowledges the devastating impact that colonization on our campus footprint, and we commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing, and education. This particular event was conceived as the ultimate culmination of a culmination week of activities for a student design project called the Sustainable Homes Challenge. I mean, this morning we're very excited to hear about the wonderful activities that industry are already championing. And we've got a very strong lineup of speakers who are innovating and leading in the field in this space. This morning, we're going to have these activities from industry, and in the afternoon, we're going to have the highlight really of the whole of the Sustainable Homes Challenge. Our students are going to pitch their final designs incorporating waste into residential construction. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. Without sponsorship, this would not have happened. And the particular sponsorship I wish to acknowledge is the McKinnon Walker Trust, whose Ken McKinnon was a previous Vice Chancellor of the University of Wollongong. And his vision has set up this trust, which enables members of the university community to try out some crazy and wacky ideas. And this was the one that we chose, and Leela has been championing it really for the last 2 years. But on top of that, we've got fantastic support from the Housing Trust, with our gold sponsor for prizes, Engineers Australia, BlueScope, and this morning's symposium is supported by the Office of the Chief Scientist of New South Wales and the Chief Engineer. So this is the rundown for today. From now until 11, we've got session 1, which is the circular economy and construction. We'll have a little bit of a break, and this will give you an opportunity to post questions to our poster presenters. So we parallel to this, we have a poster session going on. So I recommend that you get yourself a coffee at 11 o'clock and visit the poster session and ask the attendees there questions about their work. From 11:30 to 1, we'll carry on with session 2 of the symposium, Reducing Construction Waste. And this afternoon is, as I said, the highlight of it. Our students who have been working on their design projects all year will present the final outcomes, and these will be judged, and we'll have our prize giving ceremony at the end. Next slide, please. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers in here, and I'll introduce them just before they speak. But we've got Monica Richter, who is the project director of MECLA, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance. Ken McBryde, an architecture designer, and Professor Usha Iyer-Raniga from RMIT, Jonas Bengtsson from Edge Environment, and you'll see Valentina Petrone from Circular Economy in the Waste Management and Resources Recovery in WSP, one of our largest consultancy companies. The order of events, in this online world, people are demanded by others across the globe. So we've had to reschedule things a little bit. And our first speaker today is going to be Ken McBryde. Now, Ken is a designer. He's the director of Gensler, which is based in the Sydney studio. He's a thought leader in construction and mixed-use industry. Ken is regularly called upon to speak at conferences, join design award juries, and contribute to research projects. His extensive local and international experience of design of highly innovative public and cultural spaces, hospitality, retail, commercial, residential, and infrastructure. This guy does everything. In 2013, Ken founded one of my favorite organizations, the Architectural Physics Pty Limited. So Architectural Physics is a really interesting organization. He's also executive producer and presenter on the new TV series, The Placemakers. So watch out for that. This explores some of the most influential placemakers and innovative spaces. Ken has a natural affinity with construction methodology and materials, which underpins his unique approach. He has recently completed a highly successful collaborative research project with Melbourne and Swinburne universities, the CSIRO and the FWPA. A highlighted outcome is the improved adhesion in gluing. And glues are a material that can cause problems in construction, both from their toxicity and their longevity. So he has produced glues and coatings applied to Australian hardwoods. Ken was appointed adjunct professor of architecture at the University of Sydney, 2016. He's a conjoined professor of practice at the University of Newcastle and is a state-appointed architectural expert on the Sydney and regional planning panels. So welcome, Ken, and I'll hand over the control of the slides to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tim. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, that's loud and clear.
And is the screen all working now?
Perfect.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be part of this symposium, and I'm particularly excited to join a discussion around making homes from waste. Do we have the chat working, Leela?
We have a Q&A working, so people can post their questions within the Q&A.
That's if anyone wants, and I'll see if I can manage that as well. Plastic is an amazing material. We've been producing more and more of it for over 50 years now, and probably around 270 million tonnes a year. And here's some other extraordinary things. You know, if you try to get your head around what that is, the massive plastic we produce per year is about the equivalent to the entire population of the world. So it's kind of a frightening concept. And when you think that that all the plastic that we've ever produced is still in circulation, apart from some of it has been burnt. I'll just move this because I don't know whether that's aggravating you guys. Okay. And the other disturbing fact is that by 2030, 3 billion people will require adequate and affordable housing by 2030. And the reference for that data is on the screen. About 8 years ago, through the surfing community, I met a guy called Nev Hyman, and he had a really simple idea: turn that plastic waste into housing for the poor. And while we're at it, we'll make local industry and create jobs. So that was a brilliant idea. We assembled a team of highly specialist polymer experts, engineers from Arab materials experts, and we set about to design homes from recycled plastic waste. We knew we needed a simple and robust design that would suit the villages in Indonesia and Bali, which was our first area, because as surfers, we've seen that that's a place on the planet of high density and no municipal waste collection. So the rubbish is thrown in the ground, it washes down the gutters and ends up in the ocean, which is, as surfers, where we see it and become aware of this problem. So we wanted houses that would not only be suitable to cultural settings, but to attract government agencies and officials that would want to fund such relief housing or affordable housing. Walking up the beach between surfing and working, because we'd been in an all-day, very intense working session with air conditioning and no open windows. We took a break and went to the beach. And coming up the beach, in that moment, I realized what we needed to do was come up with an extrusion that could be not only a roof, wall, louvers, but also floors, because the cost of making plastic products, a lot of it is in the extrusions themselves. So less extrusions and more cost-effective production. So this is what we came up with about a week later after that working session. And we were very happy with that. It has generous overhangs, full height louvers. It feels like it would belong in the kampung, in the villages of Indonesia, where I'd spent a fair bit of time on surfing trips. And it did indeed attract positive responses from the governor of Bali and Indonesian housing officials. We were onto it. There was a demand. They wanted 20,000 homes a year, Nev, and we were super excited. However, we started to discover the fundamental problem of plastic and the specific challenges around recycling plastic waste. Have you guys ever attempted to get all the oil out of an oil bottle or all the detergent out of a detergent bottle? You can hang and drip and they'll still be lined with residue. We started to discover that the problem with this is that it can't be recycled when it's dirty. So to meet the structural requirements, we needed quite a lot of virgin plastic, which was not what we were setting out to do. And then we got smacked across the chops by, in March 2015, that Cyclone Pam was a catastrophe that forced us to change our thinking. We got invited to look at the situation in Vanuatu and help there, but we had not solved how to do cyclonic, how to do normal housing, because the plastic was suffering long-term deflection. So we didn't have a material, let alone anything that could be recycled and handle 300-kilometre-an-hour winds. And then, at another moment between work and play, I realised the answer had been looking at me. When I was a student, I came back from Europe and studied 5 years in research and development into engineered timber. Timber is the ultimate recycled material. Trees recycle carbon just to grow. So these are some snapshots from my work, including being taught how to design with termite-resistant timber by Clem Orchard there. And so we were very interested in a combination of timber and plastic in order to solve the problem in Vanuatu. So this is where we got to sort of Nev House version 2, and we supplied 14 nakamal. They're essentially community buildings to the villages in an extremely remote part of Vanuatu, Tanna Island. The design's fully modular, it's flat packed, and took about 5 days for a team, for some trained Australian builders and local teams of volunteers on the ground to assemble these projects. So we use recycled wood plastic composite and timber LVL, laminated veneer lumber, that is, timber portal frame structures. Some of them were used for schools and some for a range of different purposes. This is a view inside. You can see the full height louvers, center pivot. They're suffering from long-term deflection and some water penetration. So we've got some lessons to learn there. But essentially, they were very much designed for tropical climates. You can see we have the end grain protected above the footings. There's a whole discussion we could have around durability in the tropics, but one of the most important things is to protect the timber. We couldn't actually use rainwater off these buildings because there's volcanic ash landing on the roof the whole time, and it also limits the success of the solar panels, which is why we have a little bit of wind there to help top up batteries. The buildings were also used for nurses' quarters, and I think you saw that clinic as well. This is the extrusion that became from that original concept back in the workshop. But as I mentioned, we were using we're using wood plastic composite, which is a combination of mushed up timber and only 2 codes of plastic. So we were still a long way from solving the use of plastic waste. In particular, the issue is where plastic waste is collected by communities, they only collect the ones that are readily recycled, which are the same ones we're using. The chip packets and the stuff like that are not valuable, so they don't get collected by individuals who try to get their money back from doing that work in the street. So, but you know, the project was seen as remarkably successful. It had been designed with the kind of hierarchy of tropical elements. This is a typical design construction. It was celebrated by 12 tribes. It was incredibly successful. It was received very well. The next stage was to be housing, and this is the way we were presenting. This is one of the chiefs. They could understand what we were talking about. You can see it's inspired by a half house concept by Fundamental that the architect Iyer-Raniga, oh gee, his name has escaped me at the moment. The practice is called Fundamental. When you don't have enough money to build a whole house, which half do you build? If you only have half the budget, our answer was the cyclonic half. So this is the next stage we're looking at still, the half house, representing a cyclonic core and then an indoor-outdoor that can be filled in by locals and woven materials. Another interesting issue when you're dealing with cultural context, it's important probably to go into communities as a couple. This is my wife talking to a chief. Normally, women will tell women different things to what they'll tell men. So, and when you go in as a single, you can threaten the balance of the community. So that's something to think about. This is the contemporary situation in Vanuatu now, and it's why so many people get injured. They use traditional materials without understanding the load paths that are required. And so when a cyclone wallops places like this, loosely assembled Western materials become very dangerous projectiles. Traditionally, the people hung out around banyan trees, and this area is also called a nakamal, and they would huddle in the nooks and crannies of these trees. And this is a traditional construction that this skill has been forgotten when it comes to housing. We can see how the earth deflects the wind over, the house is buried deep into the ground. You can see very clear load paths here. This young guy is explaining to me how his grandfather built, and they're all taking a lot of notice now. But some of the issues we are dealing with is the footings don't look nice with the structure, the steel tubes, the misalignment, because we needed very heavy equipment to screw pile these in. The more suitable equipment would be something like this, or this handheld equipment. And so I've been working in parallel with an inventor called Glenn Carless to try and solve these problems. And I'll just whip through very quickly some ideas about footings that connect more beautifully to the structure itself and that will serve more suitably for the durability challenges we have in the tropics. The timber, and when it's exposed and not well maintained, doesn't last well, especially if it's pine. This is recycled aluminium, which I'll talk about soon. It's rapidly prototyped with 3D printing and tested in the backyard. And the footing itself is the same profile as the column, post and beam. Now, I'm sure you should squirm when you hear me talk about aluminium, because virgin aluminium is nasty stuff when it comes to environmental impact and embodied carbon. However, recycled aluminium is a fraction of that, and there's an abundance of it it's still in circulation, and it doesn't lose its structural properties when recycled. So this is where we're thinking we need to augment our flat pack housing for Nev House. Concrete, of course, to be avoided, so our footings don't have that. But check this out, look at the stair. When you're putting housing in remote areas, we sometimes don't get any information. The chiefs, we don't get any information about the sites. The chief chose the locations, as they should, for these buildings. And so the stair kit that turns up, sorry, it doesn't meet the ground. So Glenn and I have been working on that problem. And imagine if you could have a kit, a stair that could change its length and indeed change its inclination so that you can solve that problem. And that you could also use the same components to make a ramp. So I'm getting very excited working with this inventor, Glenn Carlos. This is the Revit, the Rhino model he works in, 3D printing, and the real deal. This is also getting back to basics with the post and beam system of the same elements, recycled aluminium, and we'll be infilling it with recycled plastic waste. And it's a kit of parts that takes away all screws and fixings. Therefore, we don't need trade skills on site. And that's already saving about 1/3 of cost when you think about the cost of construction. This is a prototype assembled by office workers. That was interesting. They didn't have any tools, they didn't need any, and they'd never understood what this was. The kit was given to them and they put it together in their office. The plastic that I mentioned, we're only using 2 codes. We're developing expertise out of Texas, where we can get any plastic, dental floss, aluminium, any waste. It gets mushed up and powder impression molded into this sort of approximate shape of our panels that we designed, so this is molded, not extruded, and the grey stuff in there is just junk, rubbish, no structural properties. And this is where we're headed now. And this is it integrated in the recycled aluminium post and beam system. And this is our 3D test. And this is cyclonic rated, whereas the original buildings are marginal. And this is our kind of photo, this is our composite image of the current design in the foreground on the left there, and the existing design. So you can see we've solved the problem of the stairs reaching the ground, and we've solved the problem of the footings with a far more elegant condition between the structural frame and going into the ground. I'm pretty excited about this. Meanwhile, we've won a truckload of awards with this work, Good Design Awards and Pitch at the Palace, which is the ultimate international award for startups. So it looks good on paper, but we are still a long, long way to go. For us to develop low-cost housing for remote communities out of recycled plastic waste, I'd say realistically, we're probably 2/3 of the way there, and we've been going for 8 years. Thank you very much. Happy to chat.
Oh, thank you very much, Ken. That is pretty inspiring. So I'll ask Leila if we've got any questions in the Q&A. And if not, I'm going to start off with one. I thought that it was an amazing statistic that you began with about the mass of plastic that's being produced being greater than the mass of people. And there was a report this week that the mass of manufactured products is actually greater than the mass of all living things on the planet. Yeah, so I think reusing materials is obviously the way to go. Yeah. One of the questions that has come through, Ken, is about the end of life of these recycled materials. What happens when these houses run their course and that particular plastic material or other materials need to be recycled themselves?
That's a really good question, because wood plastic composite is not easy to recycle. But I believe it can be, but it doesn't maintain its same characteristics. And laminated veneer lumber is also not easy. The stuff we've used has got red list product in it, That's the formaldehydes. We're now developing, I'm working with another brilliant inventor called James Murray Parks, and he's come up with a glue. He solved the technology, but it's basically crushed almonds. That's it. And it's a bioresin that replaces the red list as in the World Building Challenge, excuse me, Living Building Challenge. So this is a breakthrough in composite timber technology. And the aluminium, of course, is endlessly recyclable. So that's why I'm saying we're just a little way along the path. But Tim, we approach this as with the design for manufacture and assembly and disassembly. So ultimately, it's readily, the aluminium system I showed you, those components can be pulled apart and used in almost any other building type. We've designed schools with the same components, large span schools, well, 10-meter span, and a whole range of different typologies, including sheds. So this is a component, a sort of tools and components model designed for manufacture, assembly, disassembly, and reuse, of course. So thank you for that question, to beauty.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good point about using recycled materials that are, you know, completely circular. They just keep going back into being new aluminium,
Yeah.
and I think that's where we need to get to with plastics as well. That we make PET into PET,
Yeah.
And try and I suppose clean up that waste stream so that we get a purer product going into the recycling.
And I think we've got to make it valuable, Tim, which is a double-edged sword. When it becomes valuable, people pick it up and recycle it. Then it becomes more expensive to our commercial, to my client's commercial model. The cost of the waste stream is a significant risk to his business model. So there's your double-edged sword.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ken. I know that you've been called.
Yeah, 1 minute to go.
1 minute to go, and I think we've got another question, but we'll have you back a little bit later for the panel session.
I think my call will probably be maybe 20 minutes long, and I'll come back. Thank you very much for your time.
This is the wonderful world of Zoom that we live in. So good luck with that, and thank you very much for your presentation.
See you soon. Thank you, Tim.
Okay, so there's a couple of questions that I'll hold over to the panel session. And I'd like at this stage to introduce our next speaker, who is Monica Richter. Monica is an economist, social ecologist with extensive experience in environmental sustainability and an interest in the role of business in accelerating the uptake of low and zero carbon solutions. Recent career highlights include the establishing of MECLA, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance, with over 80 companies and organizations. And I'm proud to say that SBRC here at the University of Wollongong is one of the founding members. And they seek to align with the Paris Agreement objectives and principles of the circular economy. Other highlights include establishing the Business Renewable Centre Australia, driving large-scale renewable projects through power purchase agreements, deep engagement in the World Wildlife Fund's Panda Labs Innovation Programme, and running the Science-Based Targets Initiative in Australia. This is getting companies to set ambitious long-term greenhouse gas emission reduction targets aligned with the COP20 1.5 degree pathway, in partnership with the Global Compact Network of Australia. Monica is definitely another one of our thought leaders and has also been invited to many forums. So we're really delighted that you could have time to talk to us today. She's a graduate of the Future Directors Programme, board member of the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, ASBEC, and chair of the Mercury Centre Collaborative Enterprise Catalyst, board member of Pingala Community Power, and on the Women in Renewables list published by the Clean Energy Council. So a very busy life that Monica leads, so we're very pleased to have you here. I'll hand over to Monica now.
Thank you very much, Tim. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, fantastic. And I'd also like to acknowledge the country that we are on. You gave a beautiful acknowledgement, Tim, and I think it's so important that we really think about and connect to this lovely land that we are all custodians on. So my presentation is really about the, taking a bit of a bigger picture view of the nature of the issues that we face, but also the opportunity for collaboration. And I guess I'm just, going to run through these slides very quickly. We know the urgency of the climate challenge. We know that we have to keep warming to 1.5 if we are to avoid the worst effects of climate change. That means, the science is telling us that we need to halve emissions in this decade. At least, and that's a really tough challenge for us to achieve. We've got a lot of the technologies available to us, but if we don't, the consequences are really dire. We have the Paris Agreement, now Glasgow, it's setting a pathway. We've got the trajectory for us to do that. And really it's the political will, the will of business, the collaboration is a wonderful opportunity. And just also a reminder about the Sustainable Development Goals. Many of the issues of the circular economy, SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, reducing inequality, sustainable cities, our climate action, clean energy, partnership for the goals. I mean, they're all connecting to our principles of the circular economy, economic growth is in there, as Ken was talking about previously. How do we actually value the waste as a resource and create economic systems and incentives and policies that disallow those externalities to be factored out, the tragedy of the commons that I'm sure many of you know about. So one of the places where I get inspiration is listening to Outrage and Optimism, a podcast by Christiana Figueres, who was the chair of the Paris Agreement COP, and Paul Dickinson and Tom Rivett-Carnac. And if you're looking for places to get inspiration to hear about what's happening internationally, then I'd really encourage you to sign up to this podcast. And as it says there, this decade, what we do this decade will determine how well we survive, as a species going forward. I have the great privilege of supporting the Science Based Targets Initiative here in Australia. There's a recent launch of the Net Zero Standard. And why is this critical to this conversation? Because companies, for the first time, are thinking about the carbon budget. They're thinking about their scope 3 emissions, which is really critical, their value chain emissions, and they're thinking about medium-term as well as long-term targets. And those are all different conceptual frameworks that companies have not previously thought about. So in the last 5-6 years, this is a whole new framework for thinking. And as a result, the big companies, big construction firms, infrastructure, finance are all setting these net zero standards, science-based targets, and aligning their businesses towards net zero by the very least 2050, if not beforehand, and are halving emissions by 2030 at the very least as well. So just a little bit, scope 1 and 2, most companies do have data captured on their internal emissions, their electricity emissions, where we're seeing, I think I heard on the radio today that Australia is now 33% of our electricity coming from the national electricity market, at least, is renewables, which is a huge shift from where we've been just a few years ago. But the scope 3 is probably the hardest, and the place where there is a requirement for that collaboration and working across supply chains to drive those emission reductions. So embodied carbon, for those of you who are aware, the embodied carbon piece, looking at not just the transport, but it's the manufacturing of the products that go into the building and construction industry, as well as their use, as well as the reuse and disposal, which is some of what you've been dealing with in the projects that you've been learning about, and that practical application as well. So, and what we also know about embodied carbon, a report that was done recently for the Green Building Council, if we don't address embodied carbon, it will end up being 85% of the whole entire greenhouse emissions for the building and construction industry in 2050, which is pretty significant. We need to be addressing this issue, particularly as the energy emissions reduce. So the first time we were starting to think about this at the beginning of 2020, I guess, some partnership with Precinct, some folks from Precinct and ourselves. We got a little bit of money from the New South Wales government to launch a report, to undertake some research and really think about how would we address embodied carbon, what are the barriers, and how, what if we take a systems approach, what are those key intervention points? So we launched our report in August last year. And this is the systems diagram we came across. And I guess why is this important to circular economy? Because it does think about the different parts of the supply chain construction cycle from the very beginning, you know, the pre-design phase all the way through to deconstruction and reuse and materialization. So all the elements are important when you start to think about where those key intervention points and drivers are. So, you know, we found it's very complex. We know that. You heard from, you know, Ken how complex it is to do that. Investment is required if we are going to drive the decarbonisation process, and there is a lack of awareness, and there is a lot of resistance to change. Not, you know, from a risk point of view, from a conceptual point of view, the need to drive that. There's also a very significant role for government to play. Again, you know, talking about how do we value waste as a resource? How do we think about the decarbonisation journey? Here in New South Wales, we're pretty fortunate to have an activist government that's been, you know, they've set a net zero target, they're driving the policy levers, they've got procurement standards in place, which is quite exciting. And then the need to work together. So they were the key conclusions of our report. Lend-Lease, fortuitously, were undertaking a similar kind of assessment, and, you know, they looked at a whole range of different barriers, those technical and procurement barriers, knowledge, perception, governance, and economic barriers. And so as a result of our work, you know, that they said, request low embodied carbon outcomes would be really good if you could request that in your procurement. But how do you go about doing that? Which is when we worked with a whole bunch of organisations in the last half of last year. And in April, we launched MECLA, the Materials and Embodied Carbon Leaders Alliance. So these are the organisations, now 115, 116 organisations right across the building and construction sector. And it is a collaboration. We're not an industry association, we're a collaboration of organisations committed to addressing those barriers. They might be some of the organisations that you get a chance to work for when you graduate. You know, real privilege, and the passion of people in these companies to really look to address this is amazing. So, you know, aligning with circular economy principles, Paris Agreement, and then we've identified the areas that we're going to be addressing. The demand signals are needed. How do you evaluate the, you know, framework? What are those best practice evaluation tools, the knowledge sharing, common language? How do you support the uptake of innovative materials, and while acknowledging, you know, the risks around climate transition, and then supporting materials, lower carbon steel, concrete, aluminium, and then some of the innovative materials. So we've set up working groups to help us with this. There's about 25 people, somewhere between 15 and 25 people per working group driving this. We've got, you know, very, very extensive knowledge and commitment right across the supply chain to these processes. So just as a couple of examples here of the kind of outcomes that each of our working groups is going through. So in working group 1, so this is the demand side. So, you know, let's develop a policy maker and a client toolkit. You know, what is the toolkit going to look like? How do we then, you know, secondly, how do we measure and disclose? How do we actually provide those incentives for that measurement and disclose, including, you know, life cycle analysis? Show me how to deviate. Is there a way that we can do that? Perhaps, you know, through principles of circular economy, we want to be able to ensure that there are some rewards to companies that have those specifications in place, and then a pledge prerequisite You can tender for government projects if you have a net zero target, if you've set a science-based target, if you've got you know, some level of ambition there. So that's the kind of thinking that our working group is going through. Working group 2 is about to launch a discussion paper on those benchmarking tools to have input, because we know that there's, you know, there's some complexity in that area. Our knowledge base working group 3, we've got a range of case studies which will be published very soon on our website. And how do we, you know, we know how important it is. It's not sustainability, circular economy. These are not just places for the sustainability manager in organizations, but right across the board. So if you're a Blue Scope or a Holcim or any company, you need to be able to, you know, so it's a change management process to educate the whole of your company to understand why these principles are really important. And, you know, those are some of the opportunities that you as sort of graduates of your program are going to have a chance to experience. And then we have our events. So on Wednesday, we had our Spotlight on Steel event. We had the great privilege of having our 2 major steel manufacturers talk to us about their decarbonisation journey, what some of the challenges they're facing, the importance of and, you know, reusing the recycled steel and its availability in the marketplace. We've had a spotlight event on aluminium as well. I mean, we know what an impact both steel and aluminium, something like 13% of global emissions come from the manufacture of steel, concrete, aluminium. You know, it's a huge footprint to try and decarbonize, and there's a lot of ambition going on in there, you know, including looking at green hydrogen and alternative materials. We also know that the money is on the move. You know, superannuation funds, they're starting to look at this as an opportunity for them to drive greener outcomes. Really, really important for pension funds, superannuation funds, investors and banks as they lend money out, that they're setting in place some expectations for the companies to be looking at not just operational emissions, but embodied carbon. And this excellent report that came out recently by the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. So if you can see the slide there, you've got, you know, right at the top of the curve, you know, build nothing. You know, if you're sort of starting to rethink the way we think about construction is the best, you know, in the mitigation hierarchy. Build less, you know, thinking about how we maximize those existing assets, and build clever. And I guess that's where the principles of the circular economy, and the key messages I got out of reading the report was that importance of, you know, design optimization and dematerialization. So when it comes to, you know, high strength steel, using less steel, but a smarter steel, using less concrete, but finding ways to reduce the amount of concrete. You know, those are really, really important principles that I think will become more important. But you've got to be able to use, this was where the partnership and collaboration comes in. That's a pre-design process. You can't be thinking about this when you're starting the construction. You actually have to be thinking about this right at the beginning of the design process. Material substitution, we'll see that more and more, and the innovation is going to be required. And then rethinking ways to retain existing structures. So those principles, I think we're going to see advanced in the next you know, decade in particular. So a couple of other examples. I'm really excited to see this is a planned community where my folks live, actually, in the Redlands, outside of Brisbane, Australia's first circular economy community, which is really exciting. I'm looking forward to going across the border and going to visit and see what they're going to do. So, you know, to be able to reclaim the waste, so-called waste, and be able to repurpose it for how they live there. You know, not everybody's going to be got to educate community there, but also make it simple for the recycling and that circular economy piece. So really interesting to see that come up, and it might be, you know, the first of many circular economy communities that come together. And I just also wanted to give a shout out to Vina, who is part of our working group on other materials. And I guess, you know, I mean, universities are a critical part of this, and the micro factory and the idea, you know, she's been working with Mirvac to take the old mattresses to create these micro factories where you can repurpose what is currently seen as waste. You know, if you walk along the streets of Sydney, you see mattresses everywhere. To be able to take those mattresses, turn it into a material that then can be used in the building construction industry is just the most exciting opportunity for us to recreate new materials. And so, you know, she's very much about the use of polymers, you know, smart concrete and smart materials, and reusing waste, creating these microfactories, and just those opportunities for Australia to truly be smart. And I'm sure that there are many people at your university who are exploring those as well. And also, you know, it's not just happening here. We're seeing this happen right across the world. So the C40 city, some of you will be familiar with it. There's a clean construction declaration. They've got very ambitious targets, you know, 50% of all new buildings to have reduced embodied carbon of 50%, you know, infrastructure projects. And they are looking, you know, the cities of the world are looking for new materials and new ways of doing things. And I think the world is our oyster if we can come up with some clever ideas, you know, the kinds of ideas that Ken came up with and others. So I'll leave it there. Those are my contact details. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. We have a MECLA LinkedIn site, and, you know, we're always happy to share our knowledge with you. And I'll stop sharing.
Oh, thank you very much, Monica. That was a pretty good overview of, you know, the really big pictures. Are there any questions, Leila, coming through? I'd like to start with one of my own, and I think you sort of answered it there with the Yarra-Bilba thing, but I was looking at, are there other examples of projects that are doing that pre-design work that you talked about, that are, I suppose, the exemplars that we will look to for the future?
Gosh, well, if I recall, there were quite a few case studies in the Clean Energy Finance Corporation report, and I don't think it's business as usual as yet, but there's definitely a shift occurring. So, for example, you know, Transport for New South Wales are now requiring, I can't remember the percentage exactly, but an X% reduction in embodied carbon from their business as usual. So any company that's looking to tender for projects here in New South Wales has to be able to demonstrate that they are going to be able to deliver. That does mean talking to the steel manufacturers. It does mean talking to the concrete manufacturers. And you've got both Holcim and Boral, just as two examples, have carbon neutral or lower carbon concrete that they've developed, and they're, you know, looking to get that into various projects. They've got some testing projects in the WestConnex here in the Rozelle interchange, and there's, you know, geopolymer being tested with the City of Sydney there. So I think we'll see more and more of that pre-design occurring.
And I think that's a good example of where government can use its purchasing power to influence not just the tier 1, but the tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers in the industry. We're going to have to finish up there, but Monica, if you're available to stay around, we might have some questions coming through that could be answered in the panel session. Thank you once again, and you do so many things. I'm amazed that you could find time to be with us today. Right, it is 10:20, so it's time for us to have our first panel session. Now, the way we're going to run this, that each presenter is going to present for about 5 minutes some of the highlights of their work, which hopefully will generate questions for the Q&A. And then we'll get together with all the presenters for an open Q&A session that will be moderated by Clayton McDowell. So the presenters that we're going to have are Usha Iyer-Raniga, professor from RMIT, co-lead in the Sustainable Buildings and Construction, the One Planet Network, and the 10-year future FYP of the United Nations. Jonas Bengtsson, founder, CEO of Edge Environment, and Valentina Petrone from WSP. As I said, Clayton McDowell is going to be the moderator. He's an emerging research leader at the university. He is a holder of a Pearl Fellowship. That's what the ERL is, Emerging Research Leader, and he was our lead student on the Solar Decathlon project that took the Desert Rose House from Australia to Dubai in 2018 and got second prize overall. First up, I'd like to introduce Usha. Usha works in the School of Property and Construction Management at RMIT. She is co-leading the One Planet Network Sustainable Buildings and Construction Program, the 10-year framework program on sustainable consumption and production, which is aligned with SDG number 12, the goal number 12. And the work directly impacts on goal number 11 as well, sustainable cities and communities. Usha is a member of the Chartered Institute of Building, Green Star Associate, a member of the International Education Association of Australia, reviewer of and scientific committee member for National and International Referee Journals, referee conferences. She's on the editorial board for referee journals and has worked on special issues. She served as expert panel member and a panel judge at Victorian national and international scales. She has also served as a board member for various NGOs and industry educational bodies. Richter has published a total of over 150 publications, including research and consultancy report. So I'd like to invite Usha to share her slides and tell us a little bit more. Thank you.
Many thanks, Tim. And I'd like to start by paying my respects in this world of virtual engagement and get-togethers. I'm in the lands of the Kulin Nation, and particularly like to acknowledge the Woiwurrung and the Bunurong groups that are about 10 kilometers away from the Melbourne Central Business District. So thanks very much for your introduction, Tim, and I'm assuming you can all hear me okay. A thumbs up will be fine, great. I also wanted to sort of start off today, the work that I'm going to be presenting is a work that we've been doing with the internationally through the United Nations One Planet Network. But I also wanted to give a little bit of insight that, you know, Australia is catching up. And, you know, your speakers spoke largely from the New South Wales perspective, and I'm really interested in bringing in a little bit of a Victorian perspective into this as well. We have been very successful in 2 major grants, which has assisted us with developing what you see here as a Victorian circular activator and the integrated platform, which includes circular economy, climate change, and resilience, as well as the use of clean energy. So we're looking at the problem in the Victorian context, not just from the narrow lens of circular economy, because we do understand that you need to think about bringing in the sort of the other big players in town, largely clean energy, as well as within the context of climate change and resilience. So if you can move to the next slide, thanks. This work that we commenced at an international level for the One Planet Network started actually in 2017 at the World Circular Economy Forum, where we started looking at how do we, particularly from a built environment lens, how do we start looking at a collective impact and bring in the consumption and production practices, which is an everyday practice, into the built environment. And that sort of started a series of work that we then did in 2018 and then in 2019 and then again last year in 2020 and of course again this year across COP as well as the World Circular Economy Forum. But what was, I think, really interesting and a sort of a bit of a milestone in our global work were 7 reports that we launched last year at the World Sustainable Built Environment Conference. And these are reports looking at what is the state of play with circular built environments across all the regions that have been listed here: Europe, North America, Oceania, Middle East, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And we brought all this together with a global report, and I'll highlight some of the global report recommendations in a minute. But we also felt it was really important to understand from the building industry experts across the world, and in particular across certain regions, what are their thoughts and how do they see the importance of this transition to circularity. And so we deployed the survey which works at 2 levels. One is at the global goal level. So which are the key global goals that are important from a sustainability and circular economy perspective? Again, built environment centric, but also what are the different indicators? So if you've looked at the Sustainable Development Goals, you'll realize that there are goals, there are targets, and there are indicators. So we've got 17 goals, about 50 plus targets, and there's over 240 indicators. And these indicators are interlinked between the different goals. So it's actually goal agnostic. So when we start looking at the indicators, it's actually quite relevant to say that not just energy, which I've already talked about, but also things like water, things like health and well-being are particularly important when we start thinking about the built environment. So if we can look at the next slide, please. So what were these global recommendations? And this sort of fits in very nicely with some of the things that Ken presented as well as Monica. So the first thing that we say is that it's really important for us to think and act differently. We know that we're living in a world that is primarily dominated by linear thinking, and we cannot really solve or move into a circular economy solution if you're going to take a linear approach. So we really need to start thinking about how can we approach the circular economy problems by using circular economy principles and therefore translate that into practice about circular economy. We also think that it's very important for us to set benchmarks and to monitor where we're traveling. And we have used the Sustainable Development Goals and indicators as a means by which we can monitor and report. So we're continuously improving. Again, life cycle considerations, I won't labor the point. Monica has already very nicely expressed, the importance of thinking about the life cycle of buildings. So as Monica said, rightly, the best thing to do is not to build. So how do we then ensure that practices of urban mining and the reuse of building materials? So really, we need to start thinking about the deconstruction of buildings and then move into how we design buildings. Reverse engineering becomes very important when we start thinking about this. Again, building materials and how do we try and use local materials as much as possible in this process. Procurement, governments can lead in this process. And like the New South Wales government, our Victorian government has also been looking at how could we bring in through all the number of major infrastructure works that's taking place currently in Victoria. How do we use some of this soil and some of these materials that are low in terms of embodied energy content, but also used locally, so it's not carted off 1,000 kilometers somewhere else in the country. Adaptation and resilience, and this is, I think, something that I would like to spend perhaps a little bit more time on. We know that while we're thinking about things from a life cycle perspective, from a mitigation perspective, which has largely been the context of a number of discussions today, the importance of adaptation. So if we don't think about adaptation and resilience within this context, we actually end up with quite maladaptive responses, which means that we have to go back and we have to build again, or we have to spend a lot of materials, time, and resources in rebuilding. So trying to get that understanding of what are the impacts that climate change is going to have on our buildings, on our infrastructure, and how do we best prepare for it is something that needs to be considered. We are also interested in locally adapted solutions. And again, a history of 60,000 years, the First Nations of these people treated the earth very lightly. So how do we learn from that experience, and how do we encourage more solutions that are indigenous in nature, more locally adapted solutions? And again, Monica talked about the importance of money. Money is a mover. So how do we generate more business models? So how do we move, for instance, from this idea of owning the building, owning the lighting in a building, owning the plant and the equipment in a building, or the photovoltaic panels in a building, and move into a business model that is more of a service-based business model. And here we are talking to young decision makers of today, and potentially the key decision makers of tomorrow. So thinking about how do we overhaul our education skills. So I think I'll leave it there. My 5 minutes is probably up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Usha. And you've raised a lot of really interesting points there, and I'm sure that'll generate questions for the Q&A session. I'd like to introduce Jonas Bengtsson now. Jonas is the CEO and co-founder of Edge Consulting, and this is a really important organization. He is a past president of the Australian Life Cycle Assessment Society, ALCAS, founder of BPI Rating Tech Platform, and a member of the Living Building Challenge Australia. And SBRC is, I'm proud to say, the first building to get full certification under LBC. He's vice chair of the EPD, Australia's Technical Advisory Group. Edge is a very interesting company because they help their clients to create value by combining science, strategy, and storytelling in a way that gives them confidence to go for ambitious targets. So I'm interested to hear Jonas's storytelling for the next 5 minutes. Over to you, Jonas.
Thanks, Tim. Pressure is on. I don't think my video is blocked, so I can't get on screen, but I'll try to share my slides here, if that's okay. So. Can everyone see my slides now?
Yes, they're clear.
Cool. So I'll go through this quite quickly, and thank you, Usha and Monica. That was a really great overview, and this is inevitably going to overlap a little bit with what's already been said. But I wanted to provide a little bit of perhaps looking at it from a slightly different and complementary perspective. I remember presenting this graph many years ago around the resource use and how much materials we put into the economy. And then a little while ago, I went back and said, well, this was 10 years, 11 years ago. What's happened since then? And we've seen this trend is just continue to increase, that we now approximately 100 billion tons of materials is put into the economy on an annual basis, which is obviously quite staggering and kind of a lead indicator of us living in a very linear economy. And if we break down this massive amounts of materials that we mine and produce and put in, only about 25% of them are actually invested into long-lasting assets such as buildings or cars or infrastructure. 2/3 of it goes to waste, and we're currently on a pace of just having 10% of it recycled back to the economy. So in terms of career choices ahead of you, if you want to focus on the circular economy, I think that's a pretty safe bet that there's a lot of interest and need for change here in the next decades and even century. So it's certainly one of the macro trends that's seen in the market, the circular economy and the economic opportunity to close the loop. Some of that is thrust upon us in terms of countries where we used to export our waste and resources to. I have closed the door, and we now have to domestically deal with it much more in Australia and in the developed world. The global index that has been put out is that how circular are we as in a global economy? It's about 8.6%, and which is obviously aligned with that 10% of materials being recycled. There's work being done at the moment with the Australian Circular Economy Hub, led by Planet Arc, looking at what's that number for Australia. And without giving away too much, it's not going to be higher than 8.6% for Australia. At the same time, as mentioned before, we're facing this enormous challenge in terms of rapid changes in the global climate, which is 99.9% certainly man-made. So we're seeing this rapid need to change this trend from increasing emissions and temperatures to decarbonizing and adapting at the same time, which means that we need to rethink a lot around how we approach the built environment, both from a mitigation and adaptation perspective. And just to jump into some specific examples, so concrete was mentioned previously, specifically by Monica, and some of the work that's been done in that space. And this is a graph showing, it's a bit technical, but it's showing an environmental product declaration put out by Holcim, so one of the major concrete manufacturers. And what this is showing is that already today, the mixes that they put out when they mix up concrete and substitute out cement with fly ash and slag from steel making is already achieving a massive reduction in carbon footprint. We worked with Holcim in developing this information, and they were even internally surprised by how dramatically lower the carbon footprint was per cubic meter of concrete. So the point of this graph here is simply to show that without really doing anything differently, there are opportunities to reduce embodied carbon in materials already on commercial mixes. And now they're starting to go above and beyond by saying, how can we bring this down even further? And through the use of offsets and carbon credits, be able to offer carbon neutral products and into the construction sector. We have the steel industry as well. So this is from Infrabuild, an Australian steelmaker, where they are looking at what if we increase the strength in the steel that we produce and invest in high performance steel, then we can reduce the weight and we can reduce the need for materials in construction, and thereby reducing material use as well as carbon footprint. So again, highly commercial engineering solution that is delivering already lower embodied carbon outcomes. And then the use of timber as well, as was mentioned before, as one of those, the ultimate renewable as it's labeled, that already is starting to using more timber in construction can also drive down the carbon footprint of buildings. So all of these are signs of optimism that there's already opportunities to do things. It's not something that we have to sit around and wait for, but we can be more deliberate in the design and selection of materials. Now, I was asked a question a while back, which having worked in this field for almost 15 years, that what are sustainable materials? And I was taken aback because I didn't have that one-liner ready to go about what does that mean, and started to write down a little bit, well, what is it and what isn't it? And some of this has already been touched on in terms of how should we evaluate this? Because I don't think there's one, you can hold up a material and say, this is sustainable. It's around the context, how it's used and how we look at it. And we mentioned that it needs to contribute to the overall life cycle improvements and not be single stage that is just recyclable at the end of life without taking consideration about how it's made. Needs to look at across a broad range of issues. So already just in this short introduction here, circular economy and low embodied carbon and greenhouse gas emissions needs to be considered, but there's much more in terms of environment, people, economics that needs to be weighed into the definition of sustainable materials. And we need to look at it on a systems level, not on a material by material. It doesn't make sense to say a ton of timber, concrete, steel, how it compares. It needs to be around how does this come together in a wall system, in a roof system, in a whole building, and move away from being single focused, bamboo is better, or promote single specific materials. We need to be material agnostics because we can't achieve development at the scale that's needed globally. If we start eliminating materials, we need them all to work together. And we need to demand that the information that comes from industry is third-party verified and credible and transparent, not suppliers marking their own homework. And circular economy is such a central topic that you can't really claim to have a sustainable material or a solution and contribution without speaking to the circular economy principles of keeping resources in use and design out waste and pollution, and actually start to regenerate natural system, not doing less bad and reduce impact. So it is a mouthful to talk about sustainable materials, but I think it's great to see with Monica and Usha and everyone talking so far that there's a great deal of alignment on this topic. life cycle has been brought up, and Tim, you pointed out my background in the Life Cycle Assessment Society, which is the geeky, numbers-driven side of personality, but I do love life cycle assessment. I think it's a great tool because it brings together the holistic scope of looking at all the life cycle stages as well as multiple issues, and provide a method and framework for actually balancing and optimizing and ensuring there's no burden shift between life cycle stages or different environmental impacts that we can actually balance and optimize on that basis. And we have the products that come out from manufacturers and suppliers doing their homework, doing their life cycle analysis. They can then communicate this into an internationally standardized format called environmental product declarations, which is like a nutrition label of products, but it provides not the protein, fat, and energy, but it provides the carbon emissions, the smog, the embodied energy, the waste and water, and a number of relevant environmental impacts. So this is what we have in terms of standardized environmental information on a product level. Now this needs to be put together. All those EPDs needs to feed into what does this mean for the overall building and asset? What's the combined carbon footprint, the combined resource use, the combined embodied water, etc. And how does that work in combination with reducing operational waste, operational energy use, operational water, and what's the end of life story of this asset, and put some numbers that are standardized and comparable to that. So, Monica, thank you for mentioning the CEFC report. This is something that we helped with the Green Building Council of Australia and Infrastructure Council, the Sustainability Council, and the CEFC, and a great number of industry partners in terms of the case studies to bring in there. I really recommend looking at it because it does include case studies. It does couple circular economy and its relevance into the low embodied carbon future, as well as the economic comparisons of different material choices and design techniques. And to summarize it, it's a huge opportunity and challenge ahead of us. Embodied carbon in Australia constitutes up to 10% of our total emissions. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, $65 billion. And if we can turn this into an economic opportunity to be a solution provider here, that will mean for Australian businesses and industry in this space that there's a massive economic opportunity to be part of this transformation. So I'll leave it at there. I hope I didn't take up too much time, but thanks for the opportunity to meet you all today.
Thank you, Jonas, for introducing so many aspects of the work that you do, and that final report, I think, is one we'll put a link to that in the Q&A a little bit later. My next pleasure is to introduce Valentina Petrone from WSP. She's the circular economy lead in Australia for WSP. Has spent 15 years as an architect focused on implementing sustainable and climate resilient practices in the built environment. She's currently working with the New South Wales Department, DPI we call them lovingly, to develop the circular design guidelines for the built environment. And this has informed the circular economy strategy of the Moree Special Activation Program. I could say a lot more, but we're running short on time, so I'll hand straight over to Valentina.
Thank you, Tim, for the introduction, and thanks again for the Lilat for inviting me. It wasn't planned, but I put together a few slides to guide my presentation, and I'll try to share my screen if that's okay. So I hope you can see it correctly. I'll just keep it easy and simple. So yes, as Tim mentioned, I'm WSP Australia Circular Economy Lead, and what means for WSP is that we are an international engineering company and really looking at designing new buildings and the built environment to be future ready. So we have this very interesting program, which is the future ready under different trends. So looking at climate, society, technology, and resources, and how we can really design together, thinking about the future. And it's really exciting to see that the circular economy is part of one of the key trends under resources. And as Tim mentioned, I'm an architect by background with puts me, I'm a little bit of a black sheep in a lot with lots of engineers with WSP, and what I try to bring to the as a value add, bring to the group is my perspective from a design point of view, from an architect point of view. So looking at materials, of course, but also looking at the broader picture. So looking at circular economy from an holistic point of view. And I share with Jonas the fact that it is a very fast expanding market. So this year I've been invited to present many times, which is really amazing. And the slide you see on the screen at the moment is one of my favorite simple slides to just explain what we have been doing in the past. So just a bin full of a lot of materials, which was a strong linear economy. So we buy something, we use it, and we discard it. At the moment, we are in a recycling economy, but we know that for many issues linked to contamination of materials or the nature of those materials themselves that can only be downcycled, we still have a pretty full bin. We really want to aim towards a circular economy where hopefully our bins will be really empty. And thanks to the way that we design all our products and also our buildings, we can keep the materials in use as long as possible at the highest value. And the circular design principles are really the tools that we will be using in the future, and we're currently using to really try to design out waste in the first place, and then so then we minimize the use of virgin materials and raw materials, and then trying to keep those materials in use as much as possible. And the most challenging part is the third principle, to return materials to system. If we are thinking about food waste, we compost them. It's pretty straightforward how we can return nutrients back to the environment. So if we think about concrete, that's a bit more difficult, but there are good options, good opportunities coming up. And being an architect by background, I love this diagram that we have created, which easily talks about the process we are going towards for a circular built environment. So the black arrow and the black diagram is mainly the linear economy. So we used to extract raw material, manufacture them and produce the materials we needed. We just applied the conventional design approaches, and we construct our assets, we use them, and once it's finished, the timeline of a building, we just demolish them. At the moment, we really need to rethink this approach, and the key part is the design component. So as all the young designers and future professionals that are in this virtual room, I really encourage you to be really curious, and there are lots of materials available, particularly coming from Europe, amazing case studies that I strongly encourage you to keep researching, keep looking, because it's an emerging market, and it's great to see that the shift is happening, and we really need future professionals to really understand the power of a circular economy, and this shift to have hypothetically buildings that can be fully disassembled, deconstructed, and the materials being reused as is, or with a minor remanufacturing process in new buildings. And in terms of sharing what has been my experience this year, has been absolutely crazy, which is good. As Tim mentioned, I've started with defining from scratch the circular design guidelines for the built environment that will be released officially next year, which is very exciting. And then I've started working at every scale of project. So master planning and precincts, I've worked on the Maurice special activation precinct, and I'm currently working on the Arden precinct in the city of Melbourne. I'm working also internationally with Canada, defining some construction demolition waste minimization strategies. We are defining and providing advice to design teams, because architects are really interested in this topic, and developers as well. And one type of project that I would like to share a bit of experience with you, which links well to the topic of this symposium, is in relation to build to rent, and on a linked side also student accommodation and social housing, where we see a lot of interest from build to rent developers, because finally when we have the developer that's also the building owner and manager, finally they can see and understand the power and the possibilities for implementing circular economy principles. So having buildings that can be are designed for flexibility, for longevity, that we don't own all the components anymore, but we start to implement performance-based procurement and leasing agreements. That's really going to have an impact on the ongoing maintenance and cost for the builders. So we see some developer benefits, including reducing costs for ongoing managing, but also renter benefits and user benefits. I really love the connection between circular economy in the design and sharing spaces, sharing economy, and opportunities to promote a sense of community. I think that COVID has taught everybody how difficult it is to be isolated and not connected with our our neighbors and our colleagues. So opportunities like 2 libraries, repair cafes, are all opportunities to not only reduce the amount of materials and products that we purchase and throw away every year, but also opportunities for upskilling and meeting like-minded people. Thank you. That's my few minutes of introduction, and looking forward to some questions.
Fantastic. I might jump in then, Tim. Seems though we've short on time with only about 10 minutes to ask questions, but all of those presentations are absolutely amazing and very thought-provoking from so many different perspectives. So if anyone does have any questions, I'd recommend that you just jump down to that Q&A feature and pop it in, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. There's a couple that's come through, but I'm going to be greedy and just throw something from myself out first, since I'm moderating. This is one of the greatest change management endeavors the world has ever been on. In the past, like, we've had major changes with the introduction of industry, electrification, mechanization, electronics, etc. But for the most part, these changes have also brought with them greater efficiencies and greater profits for many companies. But this change that we need to take, we're often broadcasted by the media about the extra costs that this will place on companies and on everyday consumers. And this is really open to any panel members. Do you see this as a true statement, or are there areas that we are gaining efficiencies, that we're saving costs by taking a circular economy approach, or areas where this is actually starting to become cost parity?
I'd be very happy to answer that, Clayton, if you like, if you're not pushing in. I'll try and be as brief as I can. The design for manufacture, assembly and disassembly, that paradigm, oops, sorry, my cat just fell off the window. That paradigm, the technology we're developing takes 1/3 of the construction cost out immediately. And I think we're at least 1/3 less than conventional construction. So when enough smart minds get together who are motivated to really do something, and we have a paradigm shift, and that's take away all the fixings out of the construction site, suddenly it's not costing more, it's costing less.
Fantastic. And that's the sort of answer I was looking for. Does anyone else have anything to throw on that?
I'd like to jump in there as well. So I guess there are a couple of ways to think about it. I mean, we have to, if we are going to be innovating with these materials, there are going to be some costs associated with it. You know, we're going to have to find ways for our blast furnace, steel manufacturing globally to be shifting to alternative sources of electricity and different ways of manufacturing steel. Steel is important for a decarbonised economy, so that there is some cost associated with that. But I think the dematerialization aspects to rethinking and reusing our materials is going to help us solve some of those cost parity issues into the future. And, you know, again, coming back to the clean energy finance report that was produced, there were some fantastic case studies there where, you know, number 4 Parramatta Square, for example, they delivered the project within, in fact, less in a lower cost paradigm than you would under BAU. So we are starting to see some mainstream projects delivering against those costs.
Yeah, wow, that's fantastic and inspiring to see, and hopefully other companies will look onto that and start to adopt some of these policies. And just staying with you for a second, Monica, you've got a lot of members already. One of the questions from the panel was, do you actually have a membership target, or are there, you know, you have so many already, but are you still taking new people on board?
Well, it's quite a heavy administrative burden to sort of onboard the organisations, to take them through our governance process. It's a do tank. You know, our chair, Hudson Worsley, talks about us as a do tank. So people are very deeply and highly engaged in the different working groups. I think we've drawn a line in the sand for founding partners at the moment. But next year, when we get a bit more resources and we've organised ourselves and we're sort of thinking, okay, if we're going to be around for the next 1 or 2 years to really address those issues, who else do we need at the table? You know, what I'd really think, you know, investors are starting to show some interest here. We want them to be at the table, and the banks also. And maybe there are 1 or 2 other organisations. We are taking ordinary members for our working group 5D on the other materials, you know, the circular economy piece, the rethinking, the reuse elements there, because I think that that's an area that's still a little light on. We're still working through what our thinking is. So for any organisations that are willing to come in to that particular working group, they'd be very welcome.
Yeah, great. And we've just had a question pop up here from Dan Daly. He's just said, thanks for all the interesting introductions. As with everything in sustainability transitions, moving to a circular economy is a socio-technical issue. I wonder if the panelists have any thoughts on where the greater challenges are. Technical issue with material reuse, i.e. getting all the oil out of the oil bottle, or social issues around changing consumption practices.
I might jump in on that one, because I think one of the challenges is, in my view, lack of imagination and vision, because it's been described as, you know, what we went through maybe 100 years ago in terms of including sanitation into cities and into our homes. The same type of transformation we're looking at now with renewable energy. We can't really foresee all the changes that's going to come with this, but we know that it's a cascading effect, and it's about kind of looking at what does this mean in the next 10, 20, 30 years. If you asked us collectively maybe 5 years ago, we would have struggled a little bit to articulate what does a low carbon economy and future look like. But right now it's becoming much clearer that there's tangible ways, there's technologies, there's opportunities, there's solutions, there's a will, there's new lifestyles, there's new business models. So I don't think it is around the nitty-gritty. It's about lifting the gaze and kind of go after that. This is a huge opportunity, once in a generation, if not more, opportunity to go after.
And are there design tools, Jonas, that, you know, architects and engineers are using to, you know, help this process, the best design alternative from a point of view of minimizing the life cycle impact?
I would imagine Ken is the right guy to answer that question.
I'd be delighted to answer that one. Thank you, Johannes, for passing the ball. Gensler is by far the largest practice on the planet. Therefore, we have the responsibility, and the responsibility to respond. And we have a decent chunk of our profit is put straight into research into specifically this area, where we are dead serious. We don't let stuff into our offices. Our samples are not welcome unless they are circular, or there's a damn good reason why, how it can be recycled, or, you know, they have to justify nitty-gritty in terms of our product samples. But our technology is we've got groups where we're recording all the materials around and collecting them for use across all our designers. We have we've got tools that WSP might be jealous of, that normally we would go to engineers to look at daylighting and carbon impact. We're tying all that into some of the design technologies that are developed in-house for our use.
Yeah, if I can jump on that, yes, absolutely. It's very important to embed very early in the design stage circular design thinking and think outside the box. As part of my research, I had a great conversation with Hans, a great architect from the Netherlands, who shared with me his experience to design the circular design pavilion, which is one of the best examples of circular buildings in Europe. And he said he lost many hair through the process, but was very, very exciting, very challenging, thinking outside the box and looking at the opportunities. And yes, there are barriers, but if there is a very keen design team, those barriers can be overcome, and we can achieve great results. So part of my responsibilities as my role is to work directly with architects and design teams and guide them through this process. So yeah, happy to have a chat, Ken, further to this.
I think we will, Valentina. I'm very interested in what you were saying.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the benefits of always having these panel sessions come together. It's always fantastic to hear from everyone, and I'm sure we could talk for another couple of days on all these issues, and probably should get together at some point to do those sorts of things. But we are unfortunately out of time, so I'm going to hand it back to Tim to thank everyone and close out this session. But thank you.
Thanks everybody for those wonderful presentations, and thanks for everybody who posted questions in the Q&A. We haven't been able to get to every question, but I think there's been a really good debate about things, and I think the important aspects have been highlighted very clearly. Now it's time for us to exercise a bit. We've been sitting down in front of a screen for a couple of hours now, so it's a good opportunity for us to stretch our legs. We're going to have a bit of a break. We will reconvene at 11:30, but in the meantime, we've got a link here to our virtual poster session. So grab yourself a cup of tea, cup of coffee, or a nice fresh water, and come and visit the poster session, and we'll see you again for the next session at 11:30, where we've got some more excellent speakers and another great panel to go through. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.